I'm here at the Advertising Week Europe event and delighted to say I'm joined by Lord Puttnam to discuss the new system of press regulation which we appear to have today. Lord Puttnam, it seemed like it was a long way off and now the door has slammed shut on the last chance saloon quite rapidly. What do you make of it? What have we ended up with?
I think the actual result we've got sort of ticks most of the boxes that I hoped would get ticked. And I don't think we're in a bad place. I'm not sure I like the way we arrived at it. I don't like going closed door conferences. I don't like the idea of the Royal Charter because it seems to be fundamentally undemocratic. I was involved for 2 years of my life in the chairing the committee that created Ofcom, and I just know the process we went through. It's extremely rigorous and time consuming. It then went through both houses of Parliament, and by the time it emerged, I think the Ofcom regulations turned out to be extremely robust and works. And I can't, for my own belief is that press regulation is entitled to, and probably requires, when you look at right across the internet, is entitled to that amount of time, that amount of consideration, and that amount of thought. So I'm troubled by the process, but I actually think the result, ironically, isn't a bad one.
And the fact it was such a sort of last-minute deal done in the early hours of the morning was partly a result of the clause you inserted into the defamation bill. So, I mean, you sort of speeded the whole process up.
Yeah, I mean, that was the intention. And one of the ironies, of course, is exactly the same phrase that was used by David Cameron in describing his decision to withdraw from the talks last Thursday, where he said he was trying to break the logjam. That's precisely what we were trying to do in the backbenches of the House of Lords, was break what we saw as a very real logjam.
Well, the big question now is what happens if the newspaper owners do not sign up to this new system of press regulation? Do they exist outside it? I mean, that is the real serious decision which will be facing Cameron in months
My
and years
own
to
view
come.
is it will face Cameron. My own view is that I think Cameron made a big mistake, not simply accepting Leveson when it came through. But there were one or two elements of Leveson I don't think were right. I think the data protection recommendations are a bit wonky. But I think if Cameron had basically accepted the broad recommendations and said, this is the way it is, taken that to the country, we would not have put ourselves through this misery. I think that his attempt, in a sense, to finesse his acceptance is, in a way, what's caused the problem. If the newspapers don't accept it, then you've got a situation where effectively the newspapers are going head-to-head with Parliament. There will be a series, I imagine, of test cases. And depending on the outcome of those test cases, the newspapers will then have the very thing they didn't want, which is basically the law deciding on where press freedom begins and ends. I can't really believe that's what they want. I don't believe they want the High Court or a series of decisions in the High Court becoming law, and therefore that becomes the obligation. My own guess is exactly as Chris Blackhurst said today. It is newspapers have got themselves into this situation. They can't pretend anything else did it. You know, we've got 114 arrests have been made. This is really serious stuff. And yet a lot of the arguments that are coming back are almost as though the arrests and Leveson never ever happened.
And the common interpretation seems to be that the newspaper owners were outmanoeuvred by Hacked Off, which represents the victims of phone hacking. Do you see that?
I think newspaper owners outmaneuvered themselves. I sincerely do. I think that they overestimated their clout. I think they believed they could, as it were, shout their way out of this. I think this rather self-righteous cloak of freedom of expression that they wrapped themselves in, they thought would be enough. And I think they very, very badly underestimate, and continue to underestimate, the sense of unfairness and lack of justice that is seen by the public at large in terms of activities of the newspapers, certainly during and after, and obviously well before the Millie Dowler incident.
And what about this issue about how far these new proposals will affect online sites? For instance, there seems to be the idea that Huffington Post UK will be part of this new regulation, but for instance, Guido Fawkes' blog won't be. I mean, there's a minefield to come, surely.
I think it is a minefield. Unfortunately, when we did the Ofcom legislation 10 years ago, we weren't allowed to touch the internet. It was kind of verboten from us. We couldn't even refer to it, which was obviously a nonsense at the time. But I guess the central point I'd like to make this morning is that by doing this deal, by going the Royal Charter route, and by not having full parliamentary process, you are going to end up with these rather odd anomalies, and they're going to have to be sorted out sooner or later. So I actually think this is a partial solution, that we will still have to go down the route of a full parliamentary look at what is and isn't legitimate in terms of the way in which our notions, our legitimate and very important notions of freedom of speech are utilised.
So we're still at the very beginning of this process?
I think so. Someone asked the question just now, and quite rightly said, but the Americans have got First Amendment rights. Absolutely, but because the Americans have got First Amendment rights, my and my experience of American media is they're very, very conscious of how fragile those are, and they go to their way to protect them. They go to their way to protect them by having fact checkers and going to really quite extremes of making sure that they are accurate, fair, and balanced. We, because we haven't had the First Amendment rights, have probably been a little more, I don't know, casual.
And this is your tiebreaker question. Is it statutory regulation or not, David?
I think that to pretend this isn't statute is ridiculous. Of course this is statute. It is exactly what it said it was. It's an underpinning, and it's an underpinning to try and ensure compliance. That's all.
Okay, Lord Puttnam, thank you very much.